No one noticed when my phone vibrated. They were all watching her. My sister stood at the center of the room, smiling under soft lights, while my parents stood beside her like they had always chosen her side. I stayed where I had been told to stand, near the back, out of the way, useful but invisible. I heard it before I read it. A single message. Short, precise, not meant for me. I didn't react, I never do. But in that moment, I understood something no one else in that room was prepared for. Everything they had said about me, every quiet dismissal, every careful insult, was built on something fragile, and it had just cracked. I was always told where to stand, not directly, not in a way that could be argued with. It was understood through tone, timing, and small corrections that never sounded like corrections. At family gatherings, I stood near doorways. At dinners, I took the seat closest to the kitchen. At events, I stayed close enough to be useful but far enough to not interrupt conversations that mattered. No one explained this to me. It was something I learned by watching what happened when I didn't follow it. My sister never had to learn those things. She was always placed. Center of photographs, center of conversations, center of decisions. If there was a discussion about the future, her name came first and the rest of us adjusted around it. It wasn't loud favoritism. That would have been easier to understand. It was quieter than that. It was in the way my mother would look at her when she spoke, focused, attentive, already agreeing. It was in the way my father would repeat her opinions later as if they had always been his. And it was in the way they spoke to me. Just handle it. That was usually enough. I handled things. Forms, calls, schedules, small problems that needed to be solved before they became visible. If something went wrong, I fixed it before anyone had to notice. If something went right, it passed without comment. That was the balance. I didn't question it. Not because I didn't see it, but because questioning it never changed anything. It only made the room quieter in a way that felt heavier. So I stopped asking. I became careful instead. Careful with words. Careful with timing. Careful with how long I held eye contact before looking away. It made things smoother, or at least it made them predictable. When the wedding was announced, it followed the same pattern. My sister told them first. Then they told me, not as news but as instruction. "There's going to be a lot to manage," my mother said, already looking past me, already thinking ahead. "We'll need you to take care of the logistics." I nodded. There was no list yet, no details, but that never mattered. The expectation came first. The specifics followed later. Over the next few weeks, the structure built itself around that expectation. Group conversations where decisions were made quickly, then passed to me afterward as tasks. Messages sent late at night with small additions, calls to make, confirmations to handle, changes to adjust. I kept track of everything, not because I was asked to, but because it was the only way to keep up. Dates, times, names, numbers, I wrote them down. I double-checked them. I confirmed them again when something felt even slightly unclear. No one noticed that part. What they noticed was that things worked. Venues responded. Schedules aligned. Deliveries arrived when they were supposed to. And when something didn't go smoothly, it was mentioned in passing. "You should have checked that." It wasn't said harshly. It didn't need to be. I would nod again, adjust, fix it, move on. My sister didn't speak to me directly about most of it. She preferred to speak through them. If she can just handle that, she knows what to do. Tell her to make sure it's done properly this time. It was never framed as doubt, more like reinforcement, as if repeating it made it true. And I accepted it the way I had always accepted things, quietly, because there was still something underneath all of it that I believed in, not fairness, not recognition, structure, a sense that even if the roles were uneven, they were still connected. That there was still a shared understanding holding everything together. That if something truly mattered, it would be handled honestly. That if there was a real problem, it would be addressed directly. That beneath the small imbalances, there was still something stable. I didn't need praise. I didn't expect acknowledgement, but I trusted the system we were part of, or at least I thought I did. As the wedding got closer, the pace increased. More calls, more changes. More last-minute decisions passed down without explanation. I adjusted to all of it. I made sure nothing slipped. If there were gaps, I filled them. If there were questions, I answered them before they could reach anyone else. From the outside, it looked like everything was working. And that was enough. That had always been enough. I remember one evening, a few days before the ceremony. I was standing in the hallway, going over a list of confirmations on my phone, names I had already spoken to, times I had already checked. My parents were in the next room talking with relatives. My sister's voice carried above the others, light, easy, confident. Someone laughed. Then my father said something I couldn't fully hear, but I caught the last part. "She's handling it." A pause, then quieter. "Hopefully." It wasn't meant for me. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went back to the list. There was still something to confirm. There was always something to confirm. And as long as everything stayed in place, as long as nothing broke, there was no reason to question anything at all. The first time something felt off, it was small enough to ignore. It usually is. My mother asked me to confirm the final guest list with the venue. She was clear about it. She even repeated the number twice, as if to make sure I would not misunderstand. I wrote it down immediately. Later that day, I called the venue, verified the count, adjusted the seating arrangement, and sent a confirmation message back. I included everything, numbers, names, timing. I always did. There was no reply. That was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened the next morning. At breakfast, my father mentioned the guest list casually, like it had never been finalized. "We still need to confirm the numbers," he said, looking at my mother. I waited. She nodded, thinking. Then she looked at me. "You didn't follow up on that yet?" Her tone wasn't sharp. It was measured, certain. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood something. "I confirmed it yesterday," I said. "You asked me to call them." There was a pause, not confusion, not reconsideration, just a pause. "I didn't ask you to finalize anything," she replied. "We were still discussing it." I didn't answer immediately. I tried to replay the conversation in my head, the exact words, the way she had said the number twice. I was sure. I thought I started, then stopped. My father shook his head slightly. "This is what I mean," he said, not looking at me directly. "You move too quickly sometimes." There was no anger in his voice, just quiet correction. My sister didn't say anything. She kept eating, scrolling through her phone, detached from the conversation in a way that made it feel settled. I felt the need to explain. "I can call them again," I said. "It's not a problem." My mother exhaled softly, like the situation had been made more complicated than necessary. "Just wait until we confirm properly this time," she said. I nodded. That should have been the end of it. And it was, on the surface. But something stayed with me. Not the mistake itself. Mistakes happen. I had made them before. It was the certainty in her voice. The way she said she hadn't asked me, as if it had never happened at all. I told myself it didn't matter. There were too many moving parts. Too many conversations happening at once. It was easy to mix things up, so I adjusted. I started double-checking more carefully. Not just the details, but the instructions themselves. When someone asked me to do something, I would repeat it back. Calmly, clearly. Just to confirm, most of the time, they would nod and move on. But sometimes there was a hesitation, a brief pause before they answered. I noticed it, but I didn't react to it. There were other moments, too. Small ones. I would enter a room and a conversation would stop, not abruptly, but just enough to feel incomplete. Someone would shift the topic, someone else would leave. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't direct, but it happened often enough that I began to expect it. Still, I didn't say anything. There was no clear reason to. Everything could still be explained. Stress, Timing, miscommunication. The wedding was getting closer. People were busy. That was enough of an explanation, or at least it should have been. A few days later, I received a message from one of the vendors. A simple question about setup timing. They referenced a schedule I hadn't seen before. I read the message twice. Then I checked my notes. There was no mention of that timing, no update, no change. I assumed it had been discussed without me. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I was still expected to coordinate it. I replied carefully. I don't have that version of the schedule. Can you resend it? There was a delay before they responded. When they did, the file they sent included notes. Names, instructions, adjustments. My sister's name was on it. My parents' names too. Mine was, I didn't react. I downloaded the file, reviewed it, adjusted my own notes accordingly. Then I moved on. That was what I always did. But the feeling didn't move on as easily. It stayed somewhere in the background, not strong enough to confront, not clear enough to define, just present. Later that evening, my mother asked me why I hadn't updated the schedule yet. I looked at her for a moment. I didn't receive the update, I said. She frowned slightly. It was sent yesterday, she replied. I shook my head. No one sent it to me. Another pause. Then she said, you need to pay more attention. I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, I opened the file on my phone and showed her the timestamp, the message from the vendor, the time it had been forwarded. She glanced at it briefly, then looked away. You should have asked, she said. And that was the end of it. I lowered my phone, nodded once, and told myself again that it didn't mean anything, that it was just another small misunderstanding, that everything was still functioning the way it always had. But for the first time, I started paying attention to something I had ignored before, not what they said, but what didn't reach me at all. By the time I started noticing patterns, they were already established. That was the part I understood too late. Individually, each moment could still be explained. Together, they began to form something harder to ignore. It started with a delivery, a set of arrangements that were supposed to arrive 2 days before the wedding. I had confirmed the order myself, verified the timing, and followed up the morning it was due. Everything was aligned, until it was. The delivery didn't arrive. I called immediately. The vendor sounded confused. We delivered it yesterday, they said. I paused. That's not possible, I replied. The scheduled date was today. There was a brief silence on the line, then the sound of typing. No, they said again, more carefully this time. We were instructed to move it up, early delivery, it was signed for. I didn't respond right away. Who signed for it? I asked. They gave me a name. It wasn't mine. I thanked them, ended the call, and stood still for a moment longer than necessary. Then I went inside. The arrangements were already there, set up neatly as if they had always belonged in that space. My sister was in the room, adjusting something on one of the tables. They came early, she said, without looking at me. Her tone was neutral, informational. I nodded. No one told me, I said. She made a small adjustment to the arrangement, then stepped back to look at it. It was a last-minute decision, she replied. Things change. I didn't argue. That wasn't new. What was new was the absence of any acknowledgement that I had been responsible for that delivery. It had been reassigned without being mentioned, and I had still been expected to manage it. I left the room without saying anything else. Later that day, my father asked me why I hadn't been present when the delivery arrived. I looked at him. It came a day early, I said. I wasn't informed. He frowned slightly. You should have checked, he replied. There was no pause this time, no room for clarification. Just a conclusion. I nodded once, and that was it. But I didn't let it go the way I normally would have. That night, I went through my messages again, every instruction, every confirmation, every change. I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was looking for gaps, things that should have been there but weren't. It didn't take long to find them. A message thread where my sister had replied to a vendor, confirming a change I had never seen. An email chain where my parents had approved a revision to the schedule without including me. Notes attached to documents I had received late, notes that referred to earlier conversations I had not been part of. I read everything slowly, carefully, not with urgency but with precision. There was no single moment that explained it, no clear instruction that said I was being excluded. But the pattern was consistent. Decisions were being made, then passed to me as responsibilities, without context, without full information, and when something didn't align, it returned to me as a mistake. I sat there for a while, my phone still in my hand. I wasn't angry. That would have been easier to process. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of distance, as if I was looking at something that had always been there but from a different angle. The next day, I started doing something I hadn't done before. I kept records, not openly, not in a way that would be noticed. Just small, precise documentation, screenshots, timestamps, saved messages. I organized them without thinking too much about why. I told myself it was just to stay organized, to avoid confusion, but I knew it was more than that. It was reassurance, proof that what I was seeing was real, that I wasn't misunderstanding, that I wasn't missing something obvious. As the day went on, more moments added themselves to the pattern. A conversation where my mother referenced a discussion I had not been part of, then asked why I hadn't followed through on it. A call where a vendor addressed me cautiously, as if unsure whether I was still the point of contact. A brief exchange between my parents where my name came up, followed by a pause when they realized I was within hearing distance. None of it was direct. None of it was clear enough to confront, but it was consistent. And consistency is harder to dismiss than isolated mistakes. By the evening, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. This wasn't just disorganization. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't even miscommunication. It was structure. A quiet, deliberate structure that placed me in a position where I was responsible without being informed, accountable without being included, visible only when something went wrong. I didn't say anything about it, not to them, not to anyone. There was no space for that kind of conversation. Instead, I adjusted. I listened more carefully. I paid attention to what was said when people thought I wasn't fully present. I noted what reached me and what didn't. And for the first time, I stopped assuming that everything I was told was complete, because it was. And somewhere in the gaps, something intentional was taking shape. Once I started noticing the gaps, they became harder to ignore. Not because they changed, but because I did. I began listening differently. Not just to what was said, but to how quickly things were corrected when I spoke. How easily my version of events was replaced. At first, I tried to be precise, careful. If I remembered something clearly, I would say it exactly as it happened. No assumptions, no interpretation, just facts. It didn't make a difference. One afternoon, I mentioned a schedule change during a discussion about the ceremony timing. "It was moved to 4:30, I said. "That was confirmed yesterday." My mother looked at me, her expression unreadable. "No," she said calmly, "it's still 4. I didn't respond immediately. "It was changed," I repeated, quieter this time. "You asked me to confirm it." She shook her head, not sharply, but with quiet certainty. "I didn't," she replied. There was no hesitation. My father leaned back slightly in his chair. "This is becoming a pattern," he said. "You keep insisting on things that aren't accurate." The room stayed still after that. No one asked for clarification. No one suggested checking. My sister remained silent, her attention fixed on something else, as if the conversation didn't require her involvement. I felt the need to prove it, not to win the argument, but to correct the record. I reached for my phone. "I have the message," I said. My mother exhaled softly, the sound controlled but deliberate. "This is exactly the problem," she said. "You always need to prove something." I stopped. My phone was still in my hand, the message open, the timestamp clear, but I didn't show it. I lowered it slowly. "It's fine," I said, and just like that, the moment passed. The timing was never discussed again. It was simply set, at 4, as if it had always been that way. That became the pattern, not denial in a way that could be challenged, but denial with confidence. Enough confidence that any attempt to question it felt unnecessary, or excessive, or disruptive. Over time, the corrections became less about specific events and more about me. "You're overthinking. You're remembering it wrong. You always complicate simple things." They were said lightly, not as accusations but as observations, as if they were helping me understand something about myself. I didn't argue. Arguing required energy, and more importantly, it required a belief that the outcome could change. I didn't have that belief anymore. Instead, I adjusted again. I spoke less. I confirmed less out loud. I kept more to myself. If something didn't align, I noted it internally and moved on. But internally didn't mean I stopped tracking it. I continued documenting everything. Quietly, carefully. Not as a reaction, but as a habit, because I had started to realize something important. This wasn't about being right. It wasn't about correcting misunderstandings. It was about control. Control of the narrative, control of what was considered true. And more specifically, control of how I was seen within that narrative. The shift became more visible as the wedding got closer. My parents began speaking about me differently in front of others, not directly negative, but carefully framed. "She tries, but she gets overwhelmed. We've had to double-check a few things. It's been a lot for her to manage." They said it with concern, measured, reasonable, the kind of tone that didn't invite disagreement. I would be standing there when they said it. Close enough to hear every word, far enough that no one expected me to respond, and I didn't, because responding would only confirm the tone they had set: defensive, emotional, difficult. My sister contributed in smaller ways, a comment here, a correction there, never direct, always subtle. "If she's handling that, maybe we should just check once more. I think there was some confusion earlier. She might have misunderstood." Each sentence was small on its own. But together, they reinforced something larger, a version of me that was unreliable, inconsistent, difficult to depend on without supervision. I could see it forming, not just within the family, but with others involved in the wedding. Vendors began confirming things twice. Staff asked questions more cautiously. There was a shift in how they spoke to me, polite but measured, as if they had been advised to be careful. I didn't confront it. There was no clear moment to point to. No single statement that could be isolated and corrected. It was all too gradual, too consistent, and that was what made it effective. One evening, my father asked me why a certain arrangement hadn't been finalized. I knew it had. I had the confirmation, the message, the timestamp, the response. "It was completed yesterday," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "We followed up this morning. It wasn't done." I felt the familiar pause settle in. The space where I could choose to respond, to explain, to show proof, or to let it pass. I chose the same thing I had been choosing. "I'll check again," I said. He nodded. "That's probably best." And the conversation ended. Later, I opened the message thread again. Everything was there, clear, undeniable, but it didn't matter, because the truth wasn't being evaluated against evidence. It was being shaped by repetition, by tone, by agreement. And I was the only one not participating in that agreement. I sat there for a long time, looking at the screen, not trying to solve it, not trying to fix it, just understanding it for what it was. And for the first time, I stopped expecting that clarity would come from speaking, because it never had. And it wasn't going to start now. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It came in small confirmations, quiet ones. The kind that don't draw attention unless you're already looking for them. By then, I was. I had stopped trying to correct anything out loud. I had stopped expecting consistency in what I was told. Instead, I relied on something else: records, messages, anything that existed outside of conversation, because conversations could be adjusted, reframed, denied. Records couldn't. The first clear confirmation came from someone who wasn't part of the family, a coordinator from the venue. We had spoken several times before, always professionally, always briefly. This time the tone was different, careful. "I just wanted to clarify something," she said. "We were told to coordinate final approvals directly through your sister moving forward." I didn't respond immediately. "Since when?" I asked. There was a pause on her end. "Earlier this week," she said. "We received updated instructions." I looked at my notes. There was nothing about that. No message, no mention. "I wasn't included in that update," I said. "I assumed you were," she replied, her voice lowering slightly. "Your name was mentioned, but the direction was to bypass you for final confirmations." Bypass. The word settled quietly, not aggressive, not emotional, just precise. "I understand," I said, and I did, more than she realized. After the call, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask why. Instead, I added it to what I already knew: a pattern of exclusion that was no longer implied. Now it was stated, externally, which meant it wasn't just internal miscommunication anymore. It was instruction, deliberate. That same afternoon, I received an email. It wasn't meant for me. I could tell by the way it was written, short, direct, and assuming shared context. It had been forwarded accidentally. No explanation attached, no message, just the thread. I opened it. It was between my sister and one of the vendors. They were discussing adjustments to the seating layout. Changes I hadn't been informed about. Decisions that affected the schedule I was still responsible for managing. But that wasn't the part that held my attention. It was a single line, written casually, without emphasis. "Let's not loop her in on this yet. It's easier if we finalize first." There was no name. There didn't need to be. I read the sentence again, then once more. It didn't feel shocking. It felt confirming, like something that had already been understood, now written down. I closed the email, didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, I just saved it. That evening, during a discussion about the same seating layout, my mother asked why certain adjustments hadn't been made yet. I looked at her. "I wasn't aware of those changes," I said. She frowned slightly. "We talked about this," she replied. I held her gaze for a moment. "No," I said quietly. "You didn't." There was a pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough for the moment to exist before it was redirected. "You need to stay updated," my father said. And just like that, the responsibility returned to me. I didn't argue. I didn't mention the email. There was no value in it because the conversation wasn't about accuracy. It was about position, and my position had already been defined. Later that night, I reviewed everything again: messages, emails, notes, not searching anymore, just organizing, lining things up in a way that made the pattern clear. Timelines. Instructions given to me versus instructions given to others. Decisions made without me versus responsibilities assigned to me afterward. It was consistent, too consistent to be accidental. And then there were the smaller moments, the ones that didn't leave records but still mattered. A staff member asking me, quietly, "Are you still the main contact?" A vendor double-checking with someone else after I had already confirmed something. A brief exchange I overheard between two coordinators. "I think we should just wait for the final word from them." "Yeah, it's been changing a lot." They didn't realize I was close enough to hear. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them, because from their perspective, they were responding to what they had been told. And what they had been told didn't match what I had been given. That was the system, not broken. Designed. By the time the wedding day approached, the structure was fully in place. I was still responsible, still expected to manage details, respond to issues, keep everything aligned. But I was no longer included in the decisions that shaped those details. I was working from incomplete information, by design, and when something didn't align, it returned to me, as an error, as a failure, as confirmation of something they had already begun to establish. I didn't resist it. I didn't step outside of it. I stayed exactly where I had always been. But now I understood it, completely, not emotionally, structurally, and that changed something, not in how I acted, but in how I observed. Because once something is clear, it stops being confusing, even if it's still unfair, even if it's still quiet, even if no one says it directly, it becomes something else. Something that doesn't need to be argued, only recognized. By the time the wedding day arrived, there was no uncertainty left, not about what was happening, only about how far it would go. Everything had been structured carefully, quietly, roles defined without being stated, expectations assigned without being agreed to, and I had been placed exactly where I was meant to be, responsible for everything that could go wrong, absent from everything that could prevent it. The morning started early. Before anyone else arrived, I was already moving through the venue, checking details that had changed overnight. Some of them I had been informed about. Most of them I had not. Tables had been rearranged, timelines adjusted, vendors repositioned. Each change required correction, not from the original plan, but from the version I had been given. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to ask who had made the decisions. I adjusted. That was still my role, to absorb the difference, to make it work without drawing attention to the fact that it hadn't been working before. By mid-morning, the pace increased. More people arrived. More instructions were passed, some directly, most indirectly. A coordinator approached me with a question about the ceremony order. I answered based on the schedule I had. She hesitated. "That's not what we were told," she said carefully. I looked at her for a moment. "Show me what you have," I said. She handed me a printed sheet. It was different, not slightly, completely. Names rearranged, timing shifted. Entire sections moved. I scanned it quickly. There was no version of this in my records. "Who gave you this?" I asked. She glanced toward the other side of the room. "My instructions came through your parents," she said. Of course they did. I handed the paper back to her. "Follow that version," I said. She nodded, relieved to have clear direction. I didn't try to reconcile it. There was no time. And more importantly, there was no permission, because reconciliation would require acknowledging that there were two versions, and that would lead to questions that would not be answered honestly. So I adjusted again, quietly. By early afternoon, the first visible issue appeared. A delay in the setup for one of the reception areas. It wasn't large, not enough to disrupt the event, but enough to be noticed. My father noticed it. "Why isn't this ready?" he asked, his voice controlled but firm. I stepped closer. "The timing was changed this morning," I said. "I wasn't informed in advance." He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. "That's not an excuse," he replied. I didn't respond. There was nothing to add. The explanation had already been dismissed. My sister passed by a few minutes later. She glanced at the area, then at me. "I thought you had this handled," she said. Her tone wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be. It carried something else, assumption, expectation, and just enough distance to make it clear that whatever was happening was separate from her. "I'm handling it," I said. She nodded slightly, then continued walking. No further discussion. No interest in the details, just confirmation that the responsibility remained where it had been placed. As the ceremony approached, the pressure became more visible. Not in volume, in repetition. Questions asked multiple times, instructions repeated in slightly different ways, corrections made publicly even when they had already been addressed. A coordinator asked me about the entrance sequence. I explained it, My mother stepped in before I finished. "No, that's not right," she said. I stopped speaking. She continued, outlining a different version, one I hadn't been given. The coordinator looked between us, uncertain. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I let her finish. Then I nodded. "We'll follow that," I said. The coordinator relaxed. Clarity had been restored, not accuracy, but clarity, and that was all anyone needed. By the time guests began arriving, the structure was complete. Every inconsistency had been absorbed, every contradiction smoothed over. Not by resolving them, but by assigning them to me. I moved through the space without drawing attention, adjusting, confirming, realigning, always one step behind decisions I had not been part of, always responsible for making them appear intentional. At one point, a vendor approached me quietly. "I just want to make sure," he said. "If something changes, who should I confirm with?" I looked at him, not at the question, but at what it represented. A system that no longer recognized me as the point of control. "You can follow the latest instructions you receive," I said. He nodded. It wasn't a clear answer, but it was enough. Because clarity didn't come from me anymore. It came from somewhere else, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it directly. As the ceremony began, I stepped back, not by instruction, by understanding. I stood where I had always stood, near the edges, close enough to respond if something went wrong. Far enough to not be part of what was going right. From that position, everything looked seamless, coordinated, intentional. No one could see the adjustments underneath. No one could see the contradictions that had been absorbed. No one could see the structure that had been built quietly around me. And that was the point, because visibility was never part of my role. Only outcome, only consequence. I watched as everything unfolded exactly as it had been designed to, not the event itself, but the narrative around it, the one that placed me just outside of it, close enough to carry the weight, far enough to be blamed for any imbalance. And for the first time, I didn't try to step back into it. I didn't try to correct anything. I didn't try to prove anything. Because by then, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a situation I could fix. It was one I was meant to absorb. And as long as I stayed within it, it would continue exactly as it had been. By the time the reception began, everything looked complete. From the outside, there were no visible fractures. The ceremony had followed its adjusted timing. The transitions had been smooth. Guests had moved through the space without hesitation, guided by a structure that appeared intentional. No one saw the corrections underneath. No one needed to. That was the design. I stayed where I had been all day, at the edges. Close enough to respond if something shifted, but removed from the center where everything appeared stable. My sister moved through the room easily. Every interaction aligned with what had been built around her. Attention followed her. Conversations formed around her. My parents stayed close, reinforcing that center without effort. It was consistent, predictable, and by then, fully understood. I wasn't waiting for anything to change. I wasn't expecting a correction, but I was paying attention. Not to the event itself, to what had been built around it. The narrative, it had been forming quietly for weeks, and I knew it would reach a point where it would need to be stated clearly. Not implied, said. It happened during a conversation I wasn't part of. I was standing a few steps away, close enough to hear without being included. A group of relatives had gathered near one of the tables. My parents were speaking to them, explaining details about the planning. I wasn't looking at them. But I was listening. "It's been a lot to manage," my mother said. "We had to step in more than we expected." There were small nods, understanding, agreement. My father added something quieter. "She tries, but it's inconsistent." There was a brief pause, then someone asked a question I couldn't fully hear, and that was when it was said, casually, without emphasis, but clearly enough that it didn't need to be repeated. "She's always been the difficult one, The family disgrace, really. There was a soft reaction, not shock, not disagreement, something closer to acceptance, as if the statement fit into something already understood. I didn't move, I didn't look up, I didn't react, because the word itself wasn't new. It had existed before, just in different forms, less direct, more controlled. Now it had been simplified, given a single shape, and placed into the open. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then I stepped away, not abruptly. Just enough to remove myself from the conversation. There was nothing to respond to, nothing to correct, because the statement hadn't been made for me. It had been made for them, to confirm something, to stabilize the narrative, and it worked. I could feel it in the way the room settled around it, the way nothing needed to be explained further. That was the role I had been given. Not suddenly. Gradually. Built through repetition. Reinforced through small corrections. Confirmed through moments like this. I walked toward the quieter part of the venue, near the hallway where I had stood a few days earlier, reviewing lists that no longer mattered. The noise from the reception softened as I moved further away. For a moment, everything felt distant, not emotionally, structurally, like I was no longer inside it. That was when my phone vibrated. A single message. I looked at the screen. It wasn't from anyone I expected. It wasn't addressed to me. Not directly. It had been forwarded. Accidentally, I assumed. The sender was someone involved in the planning. The message itself was short, precise. I opened it and read it once, then again. There was no ambiguity in it, no room for interpretation. It referenced everything I had already observed, the exclusions, the adjustments, the instructions given to others. But this time it was written plainly. A confirmation of coordination. Make sure she's not included in final decisions. It's easier to manage the narrative that way. There was more, brief mentions of specific moments, times where I had been intentionally left out, situations where I had been positioned to absorb responsibility. It wasn't detailed. It didn't need to be. It aligned perfectly with everything I had documented, everything I had observed, everything I had chosen not to confront. I didn't feel surprised. That had passed earlier. What I felt was something else. Clarity, complete and quiet, the kind that doesn't require reaction. Because it doesn't leave anything unresolved, I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and stood there for a moment, not thinking about what to do next, because there was nothing to decide. The situation had already been defined, not by me, by them. And now, finally, it was visible, not publicly, not yet, but structurally, undeniably. I returned to the reception after a few minutes. Nothing had changed. The music continued. Conversations flowed. My sister was still at the center of it all. My parents still close beside her. The same structure, the same roles, the same narrative, but something had shifted. Not in the room, in me. I was no longer trying to understand it. I already did. And for the first time, I understood something else just as clearly. I didn't need to respond to it. I didn't need to challenge it, because the truth no longer depended on my involvement. It existed. Independently. Documented. Consistent. Aligned across systems that didn't rely on memory or tone. And that meant something important, something final. Whatever came next wouldn't require me to speak at all. Nothing changed immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. The message didn't interrupt the evening. It didn't shift the atmosphere or alter the way people moved through the room. Everything continued as it had been, steady, controlled. From the outside, the event was still intact, but systems don't rely on appearances. They rely on alignment. And once something inside them stops aligning, the effects don't stay contained for long. I didn't act on the message. I didn't forward it. I didn't mention it to anyone. I simply let it remain where it already existed, within the same channels that had been used to build the narrative around me. That was enough, because it hadn't been sent to me intentionally, which meant it had already been moving through other hands, other screens, other points of visibility. I returned to my position at the edge of the room. From there, I watched more carefully than before, not for mistakes, for shifts. The first one was subtle. A coordinator approached my parents with a question, then hesitated mid-sentence. She glanced at me briefly, then back at them. "I just want to confirm," she said. "Who should I be aligning with for final decisions?" It wasn't the question itself. It was the hesitation before it. Something had interrupted her certainty. My father answered quickly. "We're handling it," he said. She nodded, but not as confidently as before. That hesitation stayed with her as she walked away. It didn't resolve. A few minutes later, I noticed two vendors speaking quietly near the back. They weren't part of the same team. Their conversation was brief, controlled, but their expressions were different from earlier, more careful, less certain. One of them looked in my direction, then looked away, not dismissively, deliberately, as if acknowledging something without wanting to make it visible. The second shift came through something more concrete. A phone, not mine. One of the coordinators had stepped aside, reviewing messages. Her posture changed slightly as she read. A pause, a second look, then a longer stillness. She didn't react outwardly, but she didn't move on from it either. When she returned to the group, her tone had changed. Still professional, still controlled, but more measured, as if she was recalibrating something internally. I didn't need to see her screen to understand. The message hadn't stopped with me. It couldn't have, because it wasn't written to be contained. It was written as instruction, and instructions move quietly, without announcement, through systems that don't ask for permission. As the evening continued, the shifts became more noticeable, not dramatic, but consistent. Questions were asked more directly. Confirmations were requested more frequently, not from me, from them. From the ones who had positioned themselves as the final authority. And each time there was a slight delay, not in the answers, in the certainty behind them, because certainty depends on consistency, and consistency had started to break. At one point, a vendor approached my sister with a question about a timing adjustment. She answered, quickly, confidently, but the vendor didn't move immediately. He paused. "Can you just confirm that against the original schedule?" he asked. She hesitated. Only for a second, but it was enough. "I'll check," she said. That moment would have gone unnoticed earlier. Now it stayed visible because it didn't align with the version of her that had been presented. Effortless, certain, in control. The structure was still there, but it was under pressure. And pressure reveals inconsistencies, not loudly, quietly, through small delays, through repeated questions, through subtle shifts in tone. My parents began to notice it too, not the cause, just the effect. Their responses became more controlled, more deliberate. They stayed closer to each other, spoke more quietly when discussing details, as if trying to maintain something that was becoming harder to hold steady. They didn't look at me, not directly, but I could feel the awareness, not of what I knew, but of what might be known. And that was enough, because control doesn't require exposure to weaken. It only requires uncertainty. And uncertainty had entered the system, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through the same channels that had been used to define me. Messages, instructions, records that didn't depend on tone or interpretation. By the time the reception began to wind down, the structure was still standing, but it wasn't stable anymore. It required effort to maintain, constant adjustment, constant reinforcement. And even then, it wasn't holding as firmly as before. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to, because the outcome had already begun. Not as a single moment, but as a process. One that would continue after the music stopped, after the guests left, after the event itself was over. That's how systems correct themselves, not in public, not all at once, but gradually, through what they can no longer sustain. I stayed until the end, not because I was needed, but because leaving early would have been noticed, and I had no reason to draw attention. When it was over, I stepped out quietly. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. The room behind me continued to settle into its final state, controlled, contained, but no longer aligned. And once alignment is gone, everything that depends on it begins to shift. The next morning was quieter than I expected, not peaceful, just reduced. The kind of silence that follows something that hasn't fully settled yet. There were no messages waiting for me, no instructions, no corrections. No follow-ups about the things I had been responsible for just a day earlier. It stopped without being acknowledged. I didn't reach out. I didn't ask what came next, because there was nothing left to manage, not for me. The group conversations continued without me. I could see them, updates, photos, small exchanges about how well everything had gone. The same structure, still trying to hold its shape, but something in it had changed. Not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to directly. Just enough to make the tone feel different, more careful, less certain. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't need to. A few days later, my mother called. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was steady, measured. She spoke about the wedding, about how everything had come together. There was no mention of the conversations, no reference to what had been said, no acknowledgement of anything beyond the surface. I listened, gave short responses when necessary, nothing more. Before ending the call, she paused, just briefly, then said, "We'll talk properly soon." I didn't answer that because I understood what it meant. Not a conversation about truth, a conversation about restoring structure, about returning things to how they were. I ended the call quietly. After that, there was distance, not formal, not defined, just absence, fewer messages, fewer expectations, fewer reasons to be included or excluded. The label didn't disappear, it wasn't corrected. But it also wasn't repeated. It didn't need to be anymore, because I was no longer inside the system that required it. I still have the message, not saved for proof, not kept as leverage, just there, unchanged, like everything else that had been written without expecting to be seen. It didn't change what happened, it didn't undo anything, but it made something clear, what I had been part of and what I was no longer willing to be. There was no final moment, no resolution. Just a quiet separation. And for the first time, nothing about it needed to be explained.